So if you live in Britain and even vaguely follow politics, you'll have seen that Alison Pearson, Telegraph columnist, had a visit from the police recently for a non-crime hate incident, and I'll be looking at that and what it means for the wider state of anarcho-tyranny in the UK. So let's start with this column in the Telegraph. Alison has one of the biggest columns in the UK, read by many, many thousands of people. And she's very influential, so this is particularly interesting. And I know her personally, and she's very cool. And what's great about Alison is she'll take risks in a mainstream newspaper column and say bold things that need to be said, which I really appreciate. But the other day, she got a visit from the Thought Police. So the column goes, "My visit from police on Remembrance Sunday is living proof of our two-tier justice system." So Alison's there getting ready on Remembrance Sunday to go and pay her respects to our fallen troops, which of course we all do in this country, except a few lefty weirdos who have a problem with it. And she didn't get to do this because two police came to her door and said she'd been accused of a non-crime hate incident, which of course is absurdly Orwellian on the face of it. Suella Braverman tried to get rid of these things or tone them down, but of course, once Labour got in, they're back with a vengeance. There's more of these than ever. The Free Speech Union estimates 65 a day of these non-crime hate incident investigations. So when Alison tried to find out what she'd actually said, they wouldn't tell her. They just said it was a post from a year ago, and they wouldn't say who had made the complaint either. So, I mean, for a start, that's completely absurd. She says, well, then how can I defend myself against this accuser? And they say it's not the accuser, the PC said, looking down at his notes. They're called the victim. Imagine how narcissistic you have to be. Alison has 165,000 followers on Twitter. Imagine how narcissistic you have to be to say, yeah, I'm the victim, guys. Like, I'm the real victim here. No, the post goes out to everyone. You can't be the victim of that post. It's any post on X is general. You're not the victim of it, unless it specifically names one person, perhaps. Maybe, which I doubt it did, but we don't know because they don't say. So completely absurd, Kafkaesque, as she calls it. And of course, aside from the narcissism of it all, obviously it can be abused by disingenuous people, which, I mean, that's virtually a feature, isn't it, rather than a bug? I mean, can you even say abused when the system itself is so absurd? It's basically a mechanism for lefty people or various idiots to try and take out their political opponents. That's virtually what it is. So this person gets called the victim, which is pretty ridiculous. And Alison goes on to say that she's a law-abiding person and it's unpleasant to be visited by the police. And of course, this is key because this is the anarcho-tyranny we have in the UK. Now, if you're not familiar with that term, it was actually coined by Samuel Francis, probably in 1993. He has an essay about it in 1994. Now, he's a controversial figure, Francis, but he had a lot of great points to make on this. And by the way, if you don't know the definition, it's defined quite nicely here as a system of government that fails to enforce or adjudicate protection of its citizens while simultaneously persecuting innocent conduct. So that's very straightforward. So Francis had this piece, and some of the complaints seem relatively minor by today's standards, but that's the nature of being prescient. He was so far ahead of his time, and this has only got worse and worse. And Francis writes, in the United States today, the government performs many of its functions more or less effectively. The mail is delivered sometimes. The population, or at least part of it, is counted, sort of. And taxes are collected, you bet. You can accuse the federal leviathan of many things: corruption, incompetence, waste, bureaucratic strangulation. But mere anarchy, the lack of effective government, is not one of them. Yet at the same time, the state does not perform effectively or justify its basic duty of enforcing order and punishing criminals. And in this respect, its failures do bring the country, or important parts of it, close to a state of anarchy. But that semblance of anarchy is coupled with many of the characteristics of tyranny, under which innocent and law-abiding citizens are punished by the state or suffer gross violations of their rights and liberty at the hands of the state. The result is that what seems to be the first society in history in which elements of both anarchy and tyranny pertain at the same time and seem to be closely connected with each other and to constitute more or less opposite sides of the same coin. He goes on, this condition, which in some of my columns I have called anarcho-tyranny, is essentially a kind of Hegelian synthesis of what appears to be dialectical opposites, the combination of oppressive government power against the innocent and law-abiding, and, simultaneously, a grotesque paralysis of the ability or the will to use that power to carry out basic public duties such as protection or public safety. And it is characteristic of anarcho-tyranny that it not only fails to punish criminals and enforce legitimate order, but also criminalizes the innocent. At the same time, the governor of North Carolina grotesquely fails to uphold his famous oath to protect the citizens of his state by keeping convicted felons in prison. He has no problem finding the time to organize a massive waste of his time and the taxpayers' money to hound and humiliate a perfectly innocent citizen for the infraction of a trivial traffic law. So there we have it, law-abiding citizens, the exact phrase that Alison Pearson uses, humiliated and punished for nothing, while criminals go free. And haven't we seen just recently in the UK, Keir Starmer releasing prisoners early? We even saw them celebrating and popping champagne bottles outside of jails. This actually happened, releasing them early so he could jail people who had posted on social media about the Southport protests and riots. So they were political prisoners and he released actual hardened criminals. So this is pure anarcho-tyranny. Of course, this current incident with Alison Pearson has other elements of thought police and free speech and so on, but at its root, it is anarcho-tyranny. The law-abiding are punished and the criminals are dealt with more sympathetically. Now, Alison Pearson also, of course, with her very successful column, is a net tax contributor. I mean, we've seen these pieces recently where half the country are not even net tax contributors. So imagine you're somebody who actually is actually putting money into the system. You're a law-abiding person. You're a respected journalist. How obscene is it that that person is the person getting the knock on the door from the police? Meanwhile, prisoners run free in Starmer's Britain in what I've called Operation Arkham Asylum, where he literally released prisoners. Come on. So then there's the irony of it being Remembrance Sunday. And this is where I really felt, I really felt for Alison, but I also kind of wanted to be there and see her absolutely blast these foolish young policemen. Because she says, today we are commemorating hundreds of thousands of British men, most of them roughly the age you two are now, who gave their lives so that we could live in a free country, not under the jackboot of tyranny. And you come here on this sacred day. Those soldiers, they could never have imagined that their country, our country, the country they died for, would ever become a place where the police would turn up at the door of a person who has done nothing wrong. And we see many memes, don't we, about would the brave soldiers have bothered storming the beaches if they knew what kind of society we were going to have. And there's something in that. Of course, you could argue that such people as the police and the soldiers in those days have always been tools of power, if you want to go down that route. I mean, the soldiers, you could say, were just tools of whatever Churchill wanted to do, and they, even though they were clearly heroic on a personal level, they were forced to do that via conscription. And you could say now the police, while not forced to do it, they're just tools of the current hegemony, which is the progressive, liberal, so-called liberal, progressive tyranny thing we have now, the total state, as Oren McIntyre calls it. So you could argue that's a continuation, or you could take the view Alison's taking, which is actually we did have some principles at that time. We were fighting for some kind of freedom, which has now been completely eroded in a way that would be disgusting to those soldiers now. And that's the other argument. And I could see both. And it's certainly a great point. I would like to have seen her making that point to these policemen. The question is this even an effective tool for the regime to use, or does it just undermine and humiliate them? I think you can look at both sides of that as well. In some ways, it creates a chilling effect. You do this to someone like Alison Pearson, she's got certain protections. She has a lot of friends she can call upon. She can get this out on GB News and other platforms, and of course in the Telegraph. On the other hand, it does create a chilling effect where people can look at it and say, well, if that happens to someone like Alison Pearson, what would I do? I don't have those resources, and I could be in trouble, I could lose my job, all sorts of things can happen. And that's why it's done, presumably. It's done to control, it's done to censor, all these obvious things. One point Oren McIntyre makes in his book, The Total State, is that censorship is a crude weapon. McIntyre says, with every citizen able to instantaneously communicate his opinions on a mass scale, the threat posed to elites who rely on popular sovereignty for power was substantial. New methods had to be deployed. This is why political opinions are now routinely censored by social media companies, though this is actually the least effective method of censorship because it is so obvious. Direct exercises of power tend to bring attention to those responsible for them, and people take notice. The elite would like to avoid engaging in obvious censorship as it gives up the game, so more subtle methods are preferred. So ultimately, I don't think this looks good for the regime. maybe it's a short-term win in some ways. They get to intimidate people, and maybe it works in most of the cases. If there are 65 a day, presumably there are many of these cases we don't hear about where the people are cowed and do self-censor as a result. But ultimately, I think it is a net loss for the regime. I think it's just too humiliating, too obvious, too clearly an abuse of power, too clearly absurd as a rule to begin with. And when you get people like Musk commenting on it, which he did on Twitter. So Peter Sweden wrote, British police visited and questioned a journalist in her home because someone was offended by a year-old post on X. Yes, in Soviet Britain, you get interrogated for posting on social media. And Elon Musk wrote, this needs to stop, which last time I checked had 18 million views. So that can't be good for the regime in this country. We already know Musk is at odds with two-tier Keir Starmer over Starmer's absurd and obscene handling of the Southport riots. So now Musk has weighed in again. And in the context of Trump's crushing victory and MAGA ruling in America, and America still being the superpower in the world, and of course, supposedly having this close relationship, this special relationship with Britain, it can't be good for Starmer, for Labour, for the state, for the government in general, and for the progressive regime, which is now so at odds with the MAGA side. And we see this on the global scale. We have the EU, we have Starmer et al. At war essentially with Musk and Trump. So far Trump gets on with Starmer, but let's see how it develops, because Musk is not going to put up with these kind of things. I say put up with, what can he do? He has no official power in this country, of course, but he can make statements on X, and it looks very, very bad for the UK. And the irony is, since we're talking about Remembrance Sunday, maybe the US needs to come in once again and save us, and this time save us from ourselves. Thanks for watching. Please hit subscribe and like. People say, Nick, your channel's so underrated. That's because people aren't subscribing. So hit subscribe now. And if you want more, you can always go to nickdixon.net, where I just did an excellent interview with Academic Agent on Trump. And we did an extra half an hour only available on nickdixon.net. So go there now. It's £5 a month. You get all my content, full interviews with great guests, all my articles and videos. And of course, you help me save the West. nickdixon.net. See you next time.